She stood beneath a tree that should not exist. Its roots plunged into soil that shimmered like crushed emeralds. Its branches stretched upward into a sky so deeply, impossibly blue. It looked like the universe had folded itself open just for her. Every leaf pulsed with light. Every fiber of bark hummed with a frequency she could feel. Not in her ears, but somewhere behind her ribs. Somewhere ancient. She was not breathing. She had no lungs to breathe with. And yet, she had never felt more alive. But just moments before this, she had been dying on the floor of a small apartment, with no one coming to save her. This is not fiction. This is not metaphor. This is what happened to the woman we will call the exhausted dreamer. To understand what happened to the exhausted dreamer, you first have to understand the life she was living before she left it. She was a university student, young, ambitious, relentlessly driven by the kind of quiet desperation that doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, layer by layer, semester by semester, shift by shift. She split her days between lecture halls and late-night work shifts that bled into the early hours of morning. She survived on caffeine and willpower, two currencies that eventually run out. Her body had been sending her warnings for months. The headaches that wouldn't fade, the trembling hands she blamed on too much coffee, the dizzy spells she dismissed as dehydration. She told herself what millions of young people tell themselves every single day. I just need to push through. I just need to get to the end of the semester. But her body was already counting down to something she could not outrun. She told no one how bad it had become. That's the thing about exhaustion at that level. It doesn't look like a crisis from the outside. It looks like dedication. It looks like hard work. People praised her for how much she could handle. Her professors saw a committed student. Her coworkers saw someone reliable. No one saw the woman who sat in her car after her shifts, staring at the steering wheel for 20 minutes, because she didn't have the energy to walk to her front door. No one saw the nights when she fell asleep mid-sentence while studying, only to jolt awake in a panic, heart hammering, terrified she was falling behind. She was running a machine on fumes, and the engine was beginning to crack. Her husband noticed. He asked her to slow down. He told her that the human body is not designed to operate under that kind of sustained pressure. But the exhausted dreamer believed, as so many of us do, that rest was a luxury she simply could not afford. She was wrong, and the cost of that belief would nearly be her life. It happened on an ordinary evening. There was no warning siren, no dramatic buildup. She was standing in her kitchen, reaching for a glass of water. And then, the world tilted. A blood vessel deep inside her stomach, weakened by months of relentless physical stress, ruptured. Silently, catastrophically, her body began to hemorrhage internally, blood pooling where no one could see it. More than 30% of her total blood volume, draining away inside her own body. She hit the floor. The glass shattered beside her, and for a long, terrible stretch of seconds, there was no one there. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the sound of a young woman's heartbeat, growing slower and slower and fainter. By the time paramedics arrived, her heart had already stopped. They initiated emergency cardiopulmonary resuscitation, chest compressions forcing a rhythm back into a body that had already begun to let it go. Clinically, medically, the exhausted dreamer was gone, but something extraordinary was already happening. Because in the very same moment that her heart fell silent in that small kitchen, her consciousness ignited. She found herself rising, lifting, dissolving into a light so white, so total, so overwhelming, that every memory, every fear, every exhausted thought she had ever carried simply vanished. And what she saw on the other side of that light is something that doctors, scientists, and theologians have been arguing about for decades. But she didn't need to argue. She was there, and what waited for her in that impossible valley, beneath the branches of a tree that hummed with the memory of every living thing, would change everything she believed about life, about death, and about what we truly are. But that revelation comes next. 862 words. The night it happened began like every other night before it. The exhausted dreamer stood in her kitchen sometime past midnight, her body running on caffeine and sheer desperate will. She had worked a double shift. Before that, a full day of lectures. Before that, another night just like this one. Her body had been sending warnings for weeks. The headaches that throbbed like a second heartbeat behind her eyes, The waves of dizziness that turned solid ground into something liquid and unreliable. The strange metallic taste that crept across her tongue at odd hours. A taste she couldn't explain and chose not to question. She was 23 years old. She was invincible. At least, that is the story she told herself. But the human body does not negotiate. It does not send polite emails or schedule convenient appointments. When it reaches the absolute limit of what it can endure, it simply stops asking permission. The first thing she felt was not pain, it was heat. A sudden volcanic bloom of warmth that erupted deep in her abdomen and radiated outward. Through her torso like a match dropped into oil. Her vision blurred. The kitchen counter she'd been gripping seemed to melt beneath her fingers. And then, the floor rushed up to meet her. She collapsed without warning, without sound, without the dignity of a single cry for help. Her body struck the hardwood with the terrible final weight of something that has simply given up. Deep inside her stomach, a blood vessel, weakened by weeks of relentless stress, by cortisol flooding through her system like acid, by a body pushed so far beyond its design limits that its own infrastructure began to fail, but had ruptured. Not slowly, not gently, catastrophically. The internal hemorrhage was massive and immediate. Clinically speaking, her body began losing blood at a rate that would drain more than 30% of her total volume before anyone even knew she was on that floor. Her blood pressure plummeted. Her skin turned the color of winter marble. Her heart, starving for the fluid it needed to pump, began to race, faster and faster and faster, like an engine screaming in a car with no fuel left in the tank. Her husband found her. How long she had been lying there, she would never know. It could have been 2 minutes. It could have been 10. In the arithmetic of cardiac arrest, every second without intervention is a door closing permanently. And by the time he dropped to his knees beside her, pressed his ear to her chest and heard nothing. Several of those doors had already slammed shut. He began CPR, not the clean, precise kind you see demonstrated on mannequins in brightly lit classrooms. The real kind, the desperate kind, the kind where your arms burn and your hands shake and you press down on the chest of the person you love most in this world, and you feel how fragile the architecture of the human body truly is beneath your palms. He pressed, and pressed, and pressed. Her lips had turned a shade of blue that does not exist in the world of the living. Her eyes were open but saw nothing, fixed on some point beyond the ceiling, beyond the apartment, beyond anything he could follow. Paramedics arrived in minutes that felt like centuries. They cut open her shirt, attached electrodes, charged the defibrillator. The machine read the electrical silence of her heart and confirmed what her husband already knew in the marrow of his bones. She was gone. Clinically, objectively, measurably. The exhausted dreamer had crossed the threshold between life and death on a cold kitchen floor at 23 years old. Her heart had stopped. Her breathing had ceased. The blood that remained in her body pooled still and motionless, obeying gravity instead of pulse. And yet, this was not the end of her story. Because in the very same moment that the paramedic called out the time and reached for the paddles one final time, in the exact instant that medicine was preparing to declare its defeat, something happened that no monitor could detect, no electrode could measure, and no textbook had ever prepared anyone in that room to understand. The exhausted dreamer opened her eyes somewhere else entirely. 862 words. The exhausted dreamer did not scream. There was no warning cry, no final plea for help. One moment she was standing in her kitchen, and the next, her legs simply stopped obeying. The collapse was instantaneous. Her body folded like a letter no one would ever read, striking the floor with a sound that echoed through an empty apartment. Deep inside her abdomen, something catastrophic had already begun. A blood vessel in the lining of her stomach, weakened by weeks of relentless cortisol, sleepless nights, and a body pushed far beyond its tolerance, had ruptured. Not a small tear, a full catastrophic rupture. And now, blood was pooling where it was never meant to go. Silently, invisibly, like a river flooding beneath a frozen lake. No wound on the outside, no mark on the skin, just a quiet, internal devastation that the conscious mind could not yet comprehend. Her body was bleeding out. From the inside, the medical term is hypovolemic shock. It begins when the body loses more blood than the heart can circulate. And what was happening inside the exhausted dreamer's body in those minutes was a textbook cascade of organ-level crisis. More than 30% of her total blood volume was draining into her abdominal cavity. 30%. To put that in perspective, most emergency physicians consider 20% life-threatening. At 30, the body enters a state of profound compensation. The heart rate spikes, desperately trying to push what little blood remains to the brain and vital organs. Blood pressure plummets. The extremities go cold first, fingers, toes, lips, as the circulatory system triages itself, abandoning the periphery to protect the core. But there is a threshold, a line the body cannot hold, and she was crossing it, alone, on the floor of her apartment, with no one to call and no voice left to call with. Her skin turned the color of ash. Her breathing became shallow, irregular, mechanical, each inhale a little weaker than the last. Each exhale carrying less and less of what made her, her. The clock on the wall kept ticking. But time for the exhausted dreamer had begun to warp, to stretch, to lose all meaning. By the time her husband found her pulse was barely a whisper. The paramedics arrived to a scene that left even seasoned professionals visibly shaken. Her blood pressure was unreadable. Her pupils were fixed. Her body temperature had dropped below what the monitors could reliably register. She was, by every measurable clinical standard, in the final corridor between life and death. They loaded her onto the gurney and began cardiopulmonary resuscitation immediately. Compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Forceful, rhythmic, desperate. Each push against her sternum was an argument with biology itself, a refusal to let the body complete its shutdown. Adrenaline was administered, airways were secured, but the monitors told a story that no amount of intervention seemed able to rewrite. And then, the beeping stopped. That frantic, irregular chorus of electronic alarms that had filled the ambulance, all of it collapsed into a single unbroken tone, a flat line. The exhausted dreamer's heart had stopped beating. Clinically, legally, medically, she was dead. The paramedics did not stop working. They would not stop. But the body on that gurney had already made its decision. The machine of flesh and bone and synapse had powered down. The vessel was empty. But here is where the story fractures from everything science can explain, because in the very same instant that the monitors declared her body lifeless, the exhausted dreamer became more aware than she had ever been in her entire existence. Not less, more. She felt herself lift, not metaphorically, not in a dream. She felt the weight of her own body release her like a hand opening to free a bird. There was a sensation of rising, gentle, effortless, and absolute. She could see the paramedics below, still working, still compressing, still fighting a war they didn't know they had already lost. She could see her own face, pale, still, and impossibly distant, as if it belonged to someone she once knew, but could no longer remember. And then the light arrived, not from a direction, not from a source. It arrived from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. A white so pure, so total, so overwhelmingly present that it didn't illuminate the darkness. It replaced it entirely. It swallowed her. It consumed every shadow, every fear, every memory of pain. The exhausted dreamer was no longer in the ambulance. She was no longer in her city. She was no longer anywhere that belongs on any map ever drawn by human hands. She was crossing. And what waited on the other side was something no medical textbook has ever had the language to describe. 862 words. The paramedics would later estimate that the exhausted dreamer lost consciousness within 90 seconds of hitting the floor. A ruptured vessel deep within her stomach had begun flooding her abdominal cavity with blood. Silently, invisibly, a catastrophic failure inside a body that had been running on fumes for months. More than 30% of her total blood volume simply leaving. Her heart, starved of what it needed to pump, began to stutter. The rhythm faltered. And somewhere between the cold of the hardwood floor and the distant wail of a siren that had not yet been called, her heart stopped altogether. CPR would come later, the frantic hands of her husband pressing down against her sternum, counting compressions the way someone counts prayers. Desperate, uneven, fueled entirely by terror. But in that sliver of time between the last contraction of her heart and the first compression of his hands, something happened that medicine has no language for. She felt it first as a vibration, not a sound, not a tremor, something deeper, something cellular, as if every atom in her body had begun to hum at a frequency she had never known existed. And then, release. The exhausted dreamer described what happened next with a word that no medical textbook contains. She called it appealing. Like a second skin she never knew she wore was gently, impossibly, lifting away from the first. There was no pain. That was the part that stunned her most in the years that followed. For a body that had been drowning in its own blood just moments before, there was no pain at all. Only a lightness so profound it felt like the opposite of everything she had ever experienced in her 23 years of living. She rose, not with effort, not with intention. She rose the way warmth rises from a candle, naturally, inevitably, as though gravity itself had simply forgotten her. And then she saw herself, from above, from a vantage point that should have been impossible for any living person to occupy. The exhausted dreamer hovered near the ceiling of her own apartment and looked down at the scene below with a clarity she described as sharper than any waking moment she had ever known. There was her body, still, gray, wrong in a way that made her understand instantly and without question that she was no longer inside it. Her lips had turned the color of ash. Her skin had taken on a pallor that belonged to marble, not to a young woman who had been making coffee just 15 minutes earlier. And kneeling beside that body was her husband, his hands locked over her sternum, his shoulders shaking, his mouth moving in words she could see but could not hear, as though a thick wall of glass had been placed between the living and the no longer living. She wanted to reach for him. She tried, and that was when she discovered the most terrifying truth of the entire experience. She could feel his grief, not hear it, not see it, feel it. It moved through her like a wave of ice water, raw and absolute. His panic was a sound unto itself, a frequency of love and desperation so powerful it pulled at something deep within her luminous new form. But she could not touch him. Her hands passed through him like light passes through water. She was there, and she was not there, present in every way that mattered to the soul, and absent in every way that mattered to the body. And then the apartment was gone. Not gradually, not like a fade to black in a film. It was simply removed. One moment she was hovering above the desperate scene of her own resuscitation, and the next, she was somewhere that had no walls, no floor, no ceiling, no horizon line. The exhausted dreamer found herself suspended in a void so vast and so absolute that the word darkness does not begin to describe it. This was not the darkness of a room with the lights turned off. This was the darkness that existed before light was ever invented. Primordial, infinite, alive. She could feel it breathing around her, a presence rather than an absence, and she was not afraid. That detail mattered to her deeply when she recounted this years later. Standing at the edge of what appeared to be nothingness itself, she felt no fear, only anticipation, as though some ancient part of her recognized this place. And then the light appeared. A single point, impossibly far away and yet somehow intimate, as if it existed at the exact center of her own consciousness. It did not shine the way light shines on earth. It radiated. It pulsed. It called to her without language, without sound. With something older than both, the void was not empty. It was a threshold, and beyond it, something was waiting that would change everything. The exhausted dreamer believed about the nature of existence itself. 862 words. And then, the light swallowed her whole. Not gradually, not gently. It consumed her the way an ocean consumes a grain of sand. Instantly, totally, without negotiation. One moment, the exhausted dreamer was hovering above the wreckage of her own emergency, watching paramedics compress her chest, watching her husband scream into a silence she could no longer hear. And in the next moment, there was nothing but white. Not the white of hospital walls, not the white of a blank page. This was a white that had texture, that had warmth, that had weight. It pressed against every edge of her awareness like a living membrane, pulling her forward, through a corridor that seemed to have no walls and yet felt unmistakably like a passage, a threshold between everything she had ever known and something she had never dared to imagine. She wasn't walking. She wasn't flying. She was being drawn, like a breath being inhaled by the universe itself. And when the white finally thinned, she opened her eyes to a world that should not exist. A valley stretched before her in every direction, carpeted in a shade of green that no forest on earth has ever produced. It was emerald, yes, but deeper than emerald, richer, more alive. Every single blade of grass seemed to pulse with its own inner light, as though The ground itself was breathing, as though the land had a heartbeat she could feel, resonating through the soles of feet she wasn't sure she still possessed. Mountains ringed the horizon, enormous, snow-crowned, impossibly sharp against a sky that was not merely blue. It was a blue that went on forever. A blue so deep it crossed the boundary into something cosmic, something that whispered of galaxies folded behind its surface, of distances that the human mind was never designed to calculate. She stood at the entrance to this valley, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Nothing hurt. Her back didn't ache. Her head didn't throb. The chronic exhaustion that had lived inside her bones for as long as she could. Remember, it was simply gone, erased, as though fatigue itself was a language this place did not speak. She looked down at her hands. They were there, and yet they weren't. Not in the way she remembered them. The calluses from years of gripping textbooks and restaurant trays. Gone. The tension that had permanently curled her fingers toward her palms, released. Her hands were luminous, almost translucent. She could see light moving inside them. A soft golden current that pulsed with a rhythm that felt older than time. And she realized, with a clarity that struck her like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral, that she was no longer inside a body. She was a body. The boundary between who she was and what she was made of had simply dissolved. There was no skin containing her. There was no skeleton holding her upright. She existed as awareness wrapped in light, standing in a valley that felt more real than anything she had ever touched with human hands. The air itself was different here. She didn't breathe it. It breathed her. It moved through her like music, carrying with it information she couldn't decode but somehow understood. Every molecule seemed saturated with meaning, with history, with love. That was the word that kept surfacing in her awareness, unbidden and undeniable. Love. Not romantic love, not familial love. Something far more fundamental. A love that was structural, woven into the physics of this place the way gravity is woven into Earth. It wasn't an emotion here. It was a law of nature. And then she saw it, rising from the center of the valley like a pillar holding up the sky itself. A tree. But to call it a tree feels like calling the ocean a puddle. This was something ancient beyond calculation. Its trunk was wider than any structure she had ever seen, its bark rippling with veins of golden light that pulsed slowly, rhythmically, as though the tree itself had a circulatory system, as though it was alive in a way that redefined what alive could mean. Its branches reached so high they disappeared into the cosmic blue above, and from every limb, leaves shimmered with a light that wasn't reflected. It was generated. Each leaf was a tiny lantern, each branch a highway of luminous energy. She didn't decide to walk toward it. Her entire being simply responded, the way iron responds to a magnet, the way a river responds to the pull of the sea. She moved across that emerald field, and with every step the feeling intensified. A sensation of coming home, not to a place, not to a memory, but to a truth she had somehow always carried. Buried beneath the exhaustion, the deadlines, the double shifts, the relentless human machinery of survival, she was walking toward the source of everything. And what she would find beneath those branches would shatter every belief she had ever held about life, about death, and about what waits for us on the other side of both. 857 words. The white light did not fade. It transformed, like a curtain being drawn from a window she never knew existed. The brilliance dissolved into something her consciousness could barely process, something her human mind had no architecture to contain. She arrived, not by walking, not by falling, not by any movement she could describe with the vocabulary of the living. One moment she was wrapped in that ocean of radiant white, and the next, she was simply there, standing at the mouth of a valley so green it made every forest she had ever walked through on Earth look like a faded photograph. This was not the green of chlorophyll and sunlight. This was green as a living frequency, green as a sound. Green as a feeling that entered through her eyes and resonated in the deepest chamber of her being, vibrating at a pitch that made her entire soul hum with recognition. The exhausted dreamer, the young woman who had collapsed under the crushing weight of exams and night shifts, and a body pushed beyond its breaking point, stood now at the threshold of a world that felt more real than anything she had ever touched with human hands. The grass beneath her, if it could even be called grass, pulsed with an inner luminescence. Each blade seemed to carry its own tiny heartbeat of golden light at the tip, as though the meadow itself were a living organism breathing in slow, deliberate rhythm. She looked down and realized she could feel the ground, not with feet, because she was not certain she had feet anymore, but with something deeper. With awareness itself, the valley floor radiated a warmth that did not come from temperature. It came from, welcome. She turned slowly, and the panorama that unfolded around her was staggering in its impossible perfection. Mountains rose on every side, not the mountains she had seen in textbooks or on weekend hikes with friends. Those crude, eroded things shaped by millions of years of wind and ice. These mountains were immaculate. Their peaks were crowned with snow so white it seemed to generate its own light, and their faces were carved with a precision that suggested intention, as though some vast intelligence had sculpted each ridge, each shadow, each cascading shelf of ancient stone with the deliberate hand of a master artist who had eternity to perfect. A single stroke, and above it all, the sky. It was not the sky of Earth. It was not the thin blue membrane she had looked up at 10,000 times, without ever really seeing it. This sky was deep, unfathomably, terrifyingly, beautifully deep. A blue so rich and so saturated it seemed to have layers, like looking down into the clearest ocean from a great height and seeing depth beyond depth beyond depth, each layer a slightly different shade of cosmic indigo. And through this blue, she could see the stars, not faintly, not the way you sometimes catch a glimpse of Venus at dusk on Earth. She could see galaxies, spiraling, luminous structures turning with impossible slowness in the fabric of a sky that was somehow both daylight and infinity at the same time. Nebulae bled through the atmosphere in veils of violet and rose gold, as though the universe had chosen to hang its most breathtaking artwork directly overhead, just for her. She understood then, not through thought, but through a knowing that arrived fully formed, that this place was not a hallucination manufactured by a dying brain. This place was not less real than the hospital bed where her physical body lay, broken and bleeding. This place was more real, immeasurably, overwhelmingly more real. Every color was a color she had never seen before. Every sound carried information. Every breath she took, if breath was even the right word, filled her. With data, with history, with love so dense it had weight. The valley stretched before her like a cathedral without walls. The mountains stood as silent witnesses. The cosmic sky poured its ancient light down upon her like a benediction she had been waiting her entire life to receive without ever knowing she was waiting. And somewhere ahead, at the heart of this impossible landscape, something was pulling her forward. A presence, a gravity, not physical, spiritual, something alive and ancient and patient, rooted in the center of this world, like an anchor holding all of creation together. She had not yet seen it, but she could feel it. What waited for her at the center of that valley was something that would shatter every belief she had ever held about the nature of existence. It was alive. It was ancient. And when she finally stood before it, she would discover that it had been waiting for her since before she was born. But that is what comes next. 862 words. But the valley would not keep her. Just as the exhausted dreamer surrendered herself to the infinite warmth of the tree of life, just as the boundaries between her spirit and the universe dissolved into perfect, seamless unity, something reached in from the other side, something raw, something desperate. It was grief, not her own, but her husband's. A scream she could not hear with ears, but felt like a hook buried deep in her sternum, pulling, wrenching, dragging her backward through layers of light and warmth and peace. His anguish was a frequency, a vibration so dense with love and terror that it punched through the membrane between worlds. And in an instant, the Emerald Valley shattered like glass. She slammed back into her body on the hospital gurney. The fluorescent lights were blinding. The cold was unbearable. Every nerve screamed. She could feel the weight of her own blood, or what remained of it, pressing against organs that had nearly given up. She wanted to tell them she had been somewhere beautiful. She wanted to say she was safe, but her lips could not form words. Her chest heaved under the compressions of the medical team, and for a few fragile moments, she was here again, anchored, earthbound, but not for long. Her heart faltered a second time. The monitors screamed their warnings. The trauma team surged forward, but the exhausted dreamer was already gone. This time, the departure was different, quieter, more deliberate. as if her spirit had learned the pathway now and chose it willingly. She rose through the ceiling of the emergency bay, through concrete and steel and wiring, through layers of the physical world that meant absolutely nothing to whatever she had become. And when the light cleared, she found herself somewhere new entirely. A garden, but not any garden that could exist on Earth. Every leaf pulsed with a light that seemed to breathe. Every flower radiated a color she had no human word for. Hues that existed between the wavelengths her earthly eyes had ever processed. The air itself was thick with something she could only describe as liquid peace. And at the center of this impossible paradise, a pool. Its surface shimmered like molten turquoise, emitting a warmth that did not touch the skin, but penetrated the soul. She understood without anyone telling her that this water was not for drinking. It was not for swimming. It was for healing, a restoration so complete that it repaired wounds the body had carried across lifetimes. She stood at the water's edge, trembling with a reverence she had never known in any church, any classroom, any moment of her 20-some years of living. And then, a small white cloud appeared. It hovered just above the garden floor, no larger than a meditation cushion, luminous and impossibly still. And from within it, a figure began to materialize, slowly, atom by atom, as if the universe itself were painting a portrait in real time. A monk, robed in saffron and silence. His face was not a face she could later describe. It was more like a feeling of a face, ageless, genderless in its wisdom, radiating a calm so profound it made the peace of the Emerald Valley feel like noise by comparison. He did not speak with a mouth. He spoke with everything. The monk's transmission entered her consciousness like a key turning in a lock she never knew existed. This garden, he revealed, was not a final destination. It was a waypoint, a sacred threshold between the trauma of physical death and the vastness of the spiritual plane beyond. Souls arrived here broken and left whole. The pool was their baptism into what came next. But that was only the beginning of what he showed her. Beyond this garden, beyond the veil of healing, there existed a structure of learning so vast it redefined everything she had ever understood. About purpose, 3 levels of education in the afterlife. 3 sacred disciplines that every soul could pursue across the infinite canvas of eternity. The first was the care of animals. The stewardship of every creature that had ever drawn breath on Earth or any other world. She thought of her beloved dog, the one who had greeted her beneath the tree of life. And she understood now. That reunion was not a coincidence. It was a curriculum. The second was the care of plants, the nurturing of every living green thing. The understanding that vegetation was not decoration but consciousness. Slow, patient, ancient consciousness that held the memory of worlds. And the third was the art of healing itself. Not medicine as humans understood it, something older, something woven into the very frequency of creation. The ability to restore what was broken, in body, in spirit, in the fabric between dimensions. The monk held these 3 truths before her like sacred flames. And in that moment, the exhausted dreamer understood something that would haunt and illuminate every remaining day of her earthly life. She had not been pulled back from death to simply survive. She had been pulled back to bring one of these disciplines home. But the revelation that awaited her upon waking, the terrifying transformation that had already begun reshaping her physical body while she lay unconscious on that gurney, would prove that the boundary between the spiritual world and the material one is far thinner than anyone dares to believe. 56 words. And then the tree spoke. Not in words, not in any language the exhausted dreamer had ever studied in her university lectures or whispered in her midnight prayers. It spoke in something far older than language, something that predated syllables and syntax and every clumsy alphabet humanity had ever scratched into. Stone. It spoke in knowing. The message arrived not through her ears, but through the very marrow of her being. It poured into her the way light fills a room when curtains are finally thrown open after years of darkness. Instantaneous, total, undeniable. And the message was this: you are not a body that has a soul. You are a soul that is temporarily borrowing a body. She understood, in that single shattering instant beneath the canopy of the tree of life, that every human being walking the surface of the earth is made of the same substance. Not carbon, not water, not the periodic table of elements her professors had so meticulously cataloged. Pure love. That was the raw material, the foundational architecture, the source code written into every cell, every atom, every quantum particle spinning in the cathedral of the human body. Love was not an emotion she had been taught to feel. It was the literal fabric of her existence, of everyone's existence, of everything that had ever been or would ever be. The tree made her feel it, not as a concept, but as a lived, visceral, overwhelming experience. Every molecule in her spirit vibrated with it. She felt connected to the valley, to the emerald grass beneath her, to the snow-crowned mountains in the distance, to the animals grazing peacefully around her, to the beloved dog who had pressed its golden fur against her legs just moments before. There was no separation. There had never been separation. The loneliness she had carried through those brutal university nights, the exhaustion that had hollowed her outshift after agonizing shift, all of it had been an illusion. A temporary forgetting, and then the monk, that serene figure who had materialized from nothing more than a wisp of floating white cloud, delivered the second revelation, the one that would reshape every remaining day of her life on Earth. He told her that death is not an ending, it is a graduation. The body fails, yes. The lungs draw their final breath. The heart drums its last rhythm. The monitors flatline and the living weep. But the consciousness, the actual you, simply steps out of a vehicle it no longer needs. The way a butterfly abandons the chrysalis. The way a diver surfaces from deep water and finally breathes. He explained that what awaits beyond the threshold is not judgment, not punishment, not the cold void that atheists fear or the fire that fundamentalists threaten. What awaits is continued education, growth, purpose. 3 paths of sacred learning, he revealed: the tending of animals, the nurturing of plants, and the ancient arts of healing. The afterlife, he whispered through that radiant silence, is not retirement. It is the next semester in a university that makes every institution on Earth look like a child's sandbox. But the deepest revelation, the one that would echo through every corridor of her transformed life, was the simplest of all. Do not fear death, and do not forget to love while you are alive. That was it. That was the entire cosmic curriculum distilled into a single breath. Every religion, every philosophy, every poem ever written by trembling hands at 3 in the morning had been circling this truth like moths around a flame. She had spent years running herself into the ground, sacrificing sleep, sacrificing health, sacrificing presence, chasing grades and paychecks and the approval of people who would forget her name within a decade. And all along, the only assignment that ever mattered was love, not romantic love alone. Not the love printed on greeting cards or whispered in wedding vows, but the vast structural cosmic love that holds electrons in orbit and keeps galaxies from flying apart. The love that was woven into the roots of the tree of life. The love that shimmered in the healing waters of that impossible garden. The love that a golden dog carries in its eyes when it greets you at the door, even on your worst day. She understood now. She had been sent back, pulled from that paradise not as punishment, but as mission. She was being returned to the broken world, carrying medicine the world desperately needed. The exhausted dreamer had entered that operating room as a woman who feared everything: failure, exhaustion, inadequacy, death itself. She would leave it as something else entirely. But the transformation waiting for her on the other side of consciousness, the strange, impossible changes that would manifest in her physical body, would terrify her in ways that even clinical death never could. 862 words. The monk held her gaze one final moment. A gaze without eyes, understood without sight, felt in the marrow of whatever she was. Now, he did not speak the words aloud, but she received them the way sunlight receives. The dawn, effortlessly, completely. You cannot stay. 3 syllables that cracked the entire paradise open like a shell. The garden, the luminous pool, the ancient wisdom still echoing in the warm air between them. All of it began to tremble at the edges, not crumbling, not dying, simply releasing her. The exhausted dreamer understood then that the healing waters, the 3 sacred levels of learning, the animals, the plants, the arts of restoration, these were not being taken from her. They were being planted inside her. Seeds pressed deep into her spirit for a harvest she could not yet imagine. And then the garden vanished, not gently, not like a dream dissolving at the edge of morning. It was torn away from her with the force of a riptide dragging a swimmer beneath the surface. She felt herself falling. No, not falling. Being reclaimed, Every molecule of light that had composed her spirit form was being compressed, folded, crushed, back into a shape far too small to contain what she had become. The Emerald Valley, the snow-capped mountains, the cosmic blue sky. They collapsed into a single point of white brilliance behind her, then winked out entirely. In the void between worlds, she experienced something the monk had never warned her about. The silence of disconnection. For the first time since leaving her body, she could no longer feel the infinite web of love that had held her. She could no longer sense the pulse of every living thing breathing in unison with her own awareness. It was as though someone had unplugged her from the source code of existence itself. And the absence was more painful than any physical wound she had ever known. The first thing she felt was weight. Unimaginable, crushing, suffocating weight, not on her body, but of her body. Every cell screamed with a density she had forgotten existed. Gravity seized her spirit like a fist closing around a flame, and the flame flickered. She gasped, but the air was wrong. Thick, heavy, tasting of plastic and antiseptic and something metallic she would later learn was her own blood. Her chest burned where the paddles had fired their voltage through muscle and bone. Her veins ached with the foreign blood being pumped into her depleted body. Cold, so impossibly cold compared to the warmth of the garden. The sounds hit next, not the celestial harmonics of the valley, not the gentle knowing of the monk's silent voice. These sounds were jagged, alarms shrieking, voices shouting numbers and commands in urgent staccato bursts, the clatter of metal, instruments against steel trays. Each noise felt like broken glass pressed against raw nerves. She tried to close her eyes, to retreat back to the emerald fields, back to the tree, back to the beloved animal companion who had greeted her with such joy. But the doorway was sealed. The garden was gone. And in its place, pain, real earthly unforgiving pain, the kind that reminds you that a human body is not a temple, it is a cage. She was back inside the cage, and every bar was on fire. Her husband's voice broke through the chaos. Distant at first, then closer, trembling, fractured with a grief so raw it anchored her, more firmly than any medical intervention ever could. He was calling her home, not to this hospital room, not to this bleeding broken vessel on a cold steel gurney. He was calling her back to love, the one frequency that existed in both worlds. And so the exhausted dreamer stayed, not because she wanted to, not because the pain was bearable, but because she now carried seeds that the world desperately needed. And dying was no longer something she would ever fear again. 698 words. When the exhausted dreamer opened her eyes for the final time in that hospital room, the world she returned to was not the world she had left. The fluorescent lights above her bed hummed differently now, not just electrically, but vibrationally. She could feel their frequency pressing against her skin like the faintest whisper of warm wind. The potted plant on the windowsill, a simple fern left by a nurse days before, it was no longer just green. It was alive in a way she had never witnessed. Threads of luminous golden energy spiraled upward from every leaf, pulsing with each invisible breath the plant took. A soft, radiant aura surrounded it, shimmering like heat rising from summer pavement. She blinked. She rubbed her eyes. But the light did not fade. It was not a hallucination, not the residue of medication or trauma. It was vision itself, fundamentally rewritten. In the weeks that followed her release, something else became impossible to ignore. The energy inside her body had changed at a fundamental level. It was as though the healing pool she had bathed in on the other side had left a permanent charge within her cells. Streetlights would flicker and die as she walked beneath them. Light bulbs in her own home would surge and shatter without warning. Electronic devices malfunctioned in her presence. Watches stopped. Radios crackled with static. She wasn't imagining it. Her husband witnessed it. Her friends witnessed it. Strangers on evening walks would pause and stare as an entire row of lamps went dark in her wake. The exhausted dreamer had carried something back from that garden. Something electromagnetic, something the monk had perhaps known she would carry. The energy of the healing pool had not stayed in the beyond. It had followed her home, woven itself into the very fabric of her nervous system. And the plants, every plant she encountered now revealed its hidden architecture of light. She could see the life force rising through root systems, spiraling through stems, blooming outward in coronas of luminescent energy that no textbook had ever described. She understood then what the monk had been teaching her. The 3 levels of spiritual education: the care of animals, the nurturing of plants, and the arts of healing, were not abstract lessons meant for the afterlife alone. They were instructions for this life. The exhausted dreamer, the woman who had once collapsed under the crushing weight of exams and overnight shifts, dedicated the rest of her earthly existence to healing others. Not with pharmaceutical precision, but with the energy she now understood flowed through every living thing. She laid hands on the suffering and the grieving. She spoke of the Emerald Valley. She described the tree that held the memory of all existence. She told them about the garden, the pool, the monk who appeared from a tiny white cloud, and she delivered one singular, unshakable message. We are not bodies that temporarily contain a soul. We are souls, ancient and infinite, temporarily wearing the costume of a body. Every atom of our being is constructed from the same substance the light was made of. Every heartbeat echoes the pulse she felt beneath the tree of life. We are made of pure love, and death is not an ending. It is a homecoming. She had died on a kitchen floor. A 20-something student who thought the worst thing in the world was failing an exam. She came back knowing that the worst thing in the world is living an entire life without understanding what you truly are. The streetlights still flicker when she passes. The plants still glow, and every person she touches walks away carrying a fragment of that impossible green valley. A splinter of the light that never fades. The exhausted dreamer is no longer exhausted. She is no longer dreaming. She is, finally, awake. 672 words. The exhausted dreamer walked back into the world of the living. But she did not walk back the same. She carried with her a truth so immense that it bent the very fabric of her daily existence. Streetlights flickered and died as she passed beneath them. Light bulbs shattered without explanation. The energy coursing through her body had been rewritten, as if the universe itself now recognized her as something more than what she had been before. She could see it. The luminous threads of life pulsing from every leaf, every blade of grass, every living thing that most of us walk past without a second glance. And she devoted every remaining day to healing others. Not because she had to, but because she had seen, with absolute certainty, what waits on the other side of fear. And now, the question turns to you. When was the last time you stopped long enough to feel the pulse of your own life? When was the last time you looked at the people you love and truly saw them? Not their roles, not their routines, but the light, the impossible, stubborn, radiant light that keeps them breathing beside you. The exhausted dreamer learned something that no textbook could ever teach her. She learned that we are not bodies carrying a soul. We are souls, temporarily inhabiting a body. And that distinction changes everything. She was told there are three great teachings beyond the veil: the care of animals, the tending of plants, and the sacred arts of healing. Three forms of love, given structure and purpose in a realm most of us will not see until our final breath. But perhaps you do not need to die to begin learning them. Perhaps that learning starts now, today, with the next kind word you speak, with the next wound you choose to tend instead of ignore. If this story stirred something deep inside your chest, something that felt less like entertainment and more like remembering, then you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel, not for us, but for the stories still waiting to find you. Stories that may carry the one message your soul has been quietly starving for. Because we are all made of pure love, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, to fear. 348 words.